Raphaim after the flood, let's just broaden it, giants after the flood. Was there a second wave of this? In terms of the biblical text, we're never told anything like that as far as another period or event of cohabitation.
Most of us are familiar with the existence of the Nephilim, the giants who were born of the union of angels and women as described in Genesis chapter 6. We are also familiar with the concept of Noah's flood wiping out the Nephilim. But how do we have these examples of giants and descendants of the Nephilim, also called Raphaim, after the flood? There are a few different schools of thought in regards to this topic, but today I'd like you to take a listen to what a couple of teachers have to say about this. I have a clip here from Rob Skiba that I'd like you to see, in which he describes his theory about how these giants survived the flood.
It's not too long after the creation that we've got this event taking place in the days of Jared. Jared's name means descended. They named him because that's when the angels descended, in the days of Jared. So if my calculations are correct, that took place in 3550 BC. One of the reasons why I do not believe in multiple incursions is because I don't think that Genesis 6 even remotely supports it, even in the verse that people use. For instance, especially if you take into the account of the testimony of the book of Enoch, landing in the days of Jared, you end up with the Nephilim were in the earth in those days. What days? The days of Jared. And also after that, what is that? The days of Jared. When the sons of God came unto the daughters of men in the days of Jared, and they bare children to them, the same, now this is important, the same ones that the author's talking about, the ones who were born in the days of Jared, were the mighty men that were of old. And the Hebrew word there is olam. Olam's translated 136 times as forever and 110 times as everlasting. In other words, very, very long time ago. So the same guys that Moses is talking about were from a very long time ago. They became the men of renown. And the reason I'm focusing on olam there is because Moses is writing this about 850 years after the flood. He would not have used the word olam to describe the Nephilim that they just saw in the land of Canaan just recently. The same became the mighty men that were of olam, long, long time ago. When you read in the book of Enoch about the severity of the judgment of the watchers who participated in this experiment, you get to chapter 68 and you see that Michael, the mighty archangel himself, looks at the severity of the judgment that is being imposed on the watchers, and he turns to Raphael, and I'm going to paraphrase, "Dude, wow. No one's ever going to do that again." But it says that he's looking at this, and it says that he's trembling because of the severity of the judgment that he's seeing. And later he says, man, nobody else is going to do this in the bottom verse there. Those guys are receiving such a severe judgment. I mean, that's how severe it was. If Michael, the archangel himself, is like trembling in his boots, it's pretty severe. When I was synchronizing the text and looking at them, I'm not going to go through all of this in the red there, but I'm just going to go through the black. This is the Genesis portion of Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 18. We see in the first 4 verses that angels were mating with women. And that's backed up and synced up with the text that you see there in red. Genesis 6, 5 through 7 shows how God feels about the resulting violence. He's obviously very upset about that. Syncs up with the text that you see there. Genesis 6, 8 through 10 reveals how Noah and his sons were genetically pure. The Hebrew word used there is the same Hebrew word where it says perfect in his generations. Same word that's used to describe the pure red heifer without spot or blemish and things like that. He's genetically pure. So we have an exception there. Noah and his family, and his sons are described next, are the exception to verses 11 and 12, where it says all flesh became corrupted. So with the exception of the people that were just described in the previous verses, it says all flesh became corrupted. Syncs up with the text that you see there. Genesis 6, 13 through 17, God grows increasingly angry and tells Noah to build the ark and shows him how to do it. Syncs up with the text you see there. Then we have the first mention of the 3 wives of the 3 sons of Noah in verse 18. Therefore, it seems to me that they would have to fall into the category of all flesh that had become corrupted. And when you read the book of Jasher, it tells you that the 3 wives were not chosen until 7 days before the flood, which is the same day Methuselah died. So you basically had a funeral and a wedding. Let's look at Genesis 6:12 a little more closely here. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. That's about all we get. You know, it's just a tiny little snapshot. But you see in Joshua 4:18, and their judges and rulers went to the daughters of men and took their wives by force from their husbands according to their choice. And the sons of men in those days took from the cattle of the earth and the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and taught the mixture of animals of one species with the other in order therewith to provoke the Lord. And God saw the whole earth, and it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on the earth, all men and all animals, backed up by another witness in Jubilees 7:24. I believe where you see the after this in Jubilees right here, I believe the after this of Jubilees 7 is synonymous with the after that of Genesis 6:4. In Jubilees 7, this is a recap. This is after the flood, and Noah's sort of giving a recap of what happened that caused the flood. And he says, and after all these angels mated with women and everything, this is still in a pre-flood context, he says, and after this, they sinned against the beasts and the birds and all that moved and walked on the earth, and much blood was shed on the earth, and every imagination and desire of men imagined vanity and evil continually. Now, when I was really first studying this and looking into this, I began to wonder, what is this sinned against the animals deal? And of course, I read Joshua 4:18 and Jubilees 7:24 and came to believe that sinned against the animals is a reference to genetic manipulation, which created the animal-human hybrids of mythology, which appears to have also made a way for the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim to have host bodies to once again inhabit, thus bringing about their return. Josephus likens the first generation Nephilim to the Titans of Greek mythology. So I believe that this 500-year civil war that Enoch writes about is what the Greeks later stylized and what became known as the Clash of the Titans. Well, that's 700 years before the flood. All that's over and done with, 700 years before the flood. So that begs the question, what happened? Why did God get so upset within those 700 years? I believe that's the after this time frame that we're talking about here. And as I was looking at this scenario right here, I happened to read this quote in Dr. Judd Burton's book before I met him. He said, despite the loss of their physical bodies, there is reason to believe that the giants' spirits continued to exist. In this state, they were and are demonic entities. Like other sentient creatures, they have an eternal spirit at their essence. Therefore, the Nephilim and related tribes of giants never really ceased to exist. Only their physicality was lost. And I agree with that 100%. The book of Enoch tells you point blank that the demons or the wandering or the evil spirits were the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim that were killed. So when you have the clash of the Titans, those first generation Nephilim, their spirits went out and became wandering spirits. They lost their physicality. They're looking for bodies again. So what happened next? I believe they started this process of the genetic manipulation that we read about in Joshua 4:18 and Jubilees 7:24. They started to create host bodies for their spirits to go into. We learned from Paul that there's one flesh for birds, one for animal, one for humans. You read that quote, I think it's in 1st or 2nd Corinthians, where he's talking about that. When Genesis talks about God breathed into Adam's nostrils and he became a living soul, the Hebrew word there is nephesh. It's the same word used for the living creatures when he's making the animals. It is my opinion that God has a God-prescribed nephesh for a bird, for a dog, for a cat, for lizards, fish, and humans. So if that's the case, if that's true, what happens when you blend, let's say, a human with a goat? There's no God-prescribed nephesh for a human goat, for a satyr. So in my opinion, what you end up with is you've created a host body that is fit for a disembodied spirit to go ahead and get into. And those animal-human chimera may have been similar in characteristics to their fathers. Like reproduces after like, right? Judd talked about Azazel. Azazel is traditionally associated with the goat. So it is my opinion that the satyrs were later representation or manifestations of host bodies for the like spirit of the Azazel human Nephilim that, once they were killed off, that goat-like demonic spirit would find a host body that would be appropriate for it. We see in the text that there was violence. So it's my opinion that genetic manipulation took place of lizards there, and that all of this took place in the last 120 years leading up to the flood, which is what I believe Genesis 6:3 is really referring to. Genesis 6:3 I think is overlooked a lot of times, where it says that my spirit will no longer dwell with man, for he's flesh, and his days should be 120 years. Well, he's flesh since Adam. So what's he talking about there? He created us in his image and likeness. We are in the image and likeness of God. We are, if I can use this term, a host body, right, for his spirit to indwell. We are the temple of the Holy Ghost. Well, if you corrupt this temple, God says, I ain't going to hang out with you. If you start genetically manipulating your body such that you corrupt the temple that's in my likeness, I'm not going to hang out with you anymore. I believe Genesis 6:3 is the warning. He's sending up a flare saying, hey, all this genetic manipulation you guys are doing, you better knock it off, because if you keep it up, I'm not going to be able to dwell with you anymore. And I think that transhumanism that we see today is nothing new under the sun. What has been done will be done again. I think that that's what we're seeing take place. And I believe it was taking place in the latter 120 years leading up to the flood. And I believe that carried over into the post-flood return of the Nephilim. And I believe Moses, the same guy who wrote Genesis 6:4, tells us exactly how that happened. Again, I like timelines. This is a larger timeline that I created, showing the 350 post-flood years of Noah's life, looking at the text, where did the Nephilim come from? Looking at Genesis 9:18, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, this is a smoking gun that obliterates the multiple incursion idea. It says in Genesis 9:18 and 19, and the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And oh, by the way, Ham is the father of Canaan. Why did he put that there? He just decided to insert something there. Okay. Oh, and Ham fathered a lot of people. So why did he just single out all of us? Why did he put that there? This is before the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10. So he just says, oh, by the way, Ham fathered Canaan. Important to point out that the curse was not on Ham. The curse was on Canaan. And pretty much everybody who studies the subject of the Nephilim would admit that the Canaanites were Nephilim. That's why we see constant references throughout the Torah and the book of Joshua where God is telling the Israelites to utterly destroy these people, including the women and the children, in some cases even the animals and stuff. Wipe out everything. So we have a choice. Either God is prejudiced and schizophrenic and into random acts of genocide, or he has a legitimate reason for isolating those specific people groups, the Amorites, Jebusites, Girgashites, etc., for utter destruction, including women and children. Because in the standard rules of war, of course, the men go to battle, they fight each other, they kill each other, I get it. But they can also take the women and children and animals as spoils of war. They could take them. Except for the specific campaigns when you went to these certain ites that are listed in Genesis 10, 6 through 20, i.e. the Canaanites. And Moses tells you, oh, and by the way, Ham, not an angel, is the father of the Canaanites. And in case you don't get it, it says in verse 19, these are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth populated. Overspread in King James, right? Or overspread. This is about 800 to 850 years after the flood. Moses is saying the entire world was populated by these three people. So if he meant to say, except for that group of giants over there that were fathered by angels, this was the time to do it, but he didn't do that there. And then he goes to chapter 10 and tells you exactly where the ites come from.
That's an interesting clip, to say the least. Skiba was a little all over the place at times, but I just love his delivery and the humble attitude that he exhibits in his teachings. Basically, he concludes that the Nephilim genes made it through the flood aboard the ark from Ham's son Canaan, whose lineage proliferated into the Canaanites of whom we read in Numbers 13 and so on. But I'd like to change gears here and show you what Dr. Michael Heiser had to say about this as well.
Raphaim after the flood, let's just broaden it, giants after the flood. Was there a second wave of this? In terms of the biblical text, we're never told anything like that as far as another period or event of cohabitation. That's one of the three options for why they're there. And in short terms, one is you view either Noah or Noah's sons or the daughters married to those sons as somehow being a carrier, for lack of a better word. And for some ancient Jews, that was their answer, because you will find texts that say that. You'll find there's one text that describes Noah as a giant. Again, it tells you that when you find a text like that, it tells you they're thinking about the question, and so they feel like they've got to come up with some answer to it. So Noah was like fathered by one of them. Those who shall not be named. That.
I have to just briefly stop this video and say that I disagree with these ancient Hebrew texts because this blatantly contradicts our inspired scripture, which states in Genesis 6:9 that Noah was perfect in his generations, meaning that his bloodline was pure, and this is proven in that his lineage leads to Jesus. But that's just my 2 cents. Here's Heiser.
You'll find another text where Noah's parents are having an argument. His dad, Lamech, this is the Genesis Apocryphon. It's a very famous text. Lamech goes to his wife, who's actually given a name in the text, Bitanosh or Batanosh. Both of them mean daughter of man. But he comes to her and says, well, yeah, I heard about all this Watcher stuff going on. And I just want to make sure that this kid's mine. And they have an argument. She's like, don't you remember the other night when, so again, it tells you that they're thinking about the question. So that's one option. Another option is you view the flood not as a truly global event, but a regional event, regional or localized event. And, you can have that view and still say to the biblical writer, this was all the earth because all the nations of the earth are listed in Genesis 10. To us, that's regional, but to them it was comprehensive, whatever. But you have to somehow then have ancestors, Nephilim ancestors, survive the flood in some region of the known world. And people who take that view will usually go to the Aegean Sea, okay, because of the Philistines. The Philistines are actually members, we know this from Egyptian texts. The Philistines are a group of people from a larger group of people called the Sea Peoples, who were seafaring peoples from the Aegean. They come to the mainland, of not only Egypt but Canaan on boats. That's how they get there. Since Goliath was the son of Rapha, which you can say, well, that means he's a Raphaim, and he's a Philistine, and they're one of the sea peoples, that maybe something survived here. Jeremiah talks about the Philistines coming from Caphtor, which is one of the Aegean, islands and stuff like that. And again, people know where the Philistines came from. The third option is to take Genesis 6:1, Genesis 6:4, and translate it a little bit differently. And this is legitimate. This is possible. If you go to Genesis 6:4, it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Now, when there, you can take that particle, and because of the verb form that follows it, okay, being an imperfect verb form, you can translate it this way. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward whenever the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, they bore children to them. You'll actually see this verse referenced in Hebrew reference grammars about this particular use of the imperfect with this particle. So that's possible. Now, should we do that? Is that what it really means to say? Well, who knows, because it's a translation choice. And that's all you got. You just sort of pick one of those three, answers to the question, why we get them on the other side of the flood. And that's, targeting these Raphaim, because you get Raphaim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. It's very clear. They're described as being very tall. They're referred to as Anakim. The Anakim, according to Numbers 13, come, quote, from the Nephilim. I mean, it's point blank, what's there. So those are the paths you have to follow, to answer that question. Go ahead.
If it is the third option, do you think that would have been a second incursion by different watchers, or would that have been the first group that somehow escaped out of the abyss?
Yeah, I don't think there's any indication that the original offenders get anywhere except where they're always described as being in prison. So you would have to have the same sort of transgression of heaven and earth is what it comes down to. And there's no indication of that specifically. I mean, you could look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about because of the angels, and you could say, well, Paul apparently thought this was a possibility. Okay, you could say that, but Paul's not making a statement that it did. It's just he's like, we just don't ever want to see this happen again. It's that kind of thing. So you could take that and say, well, for Paul, maybe it was a possibility, but it's not a real answer to the question. When do I think Genesis 1 to 11 was written? Because of the heavy Mesopotamian influence there in those 11 chapters. And could Moses have had that information? That's a short way of saying it. Well, I would never want to say that Moses couldn't have had the information. Moses is an Egyptian. He's raised in the court of Pharaoh, Akkadian during the New Kingdom, which would be the Mosaic era by either chronology, either later or older chronology. Akkadian in that period, which was the literary language of Babylonian stuff, Mesopotamian stuff. was kind of like English is today. It was the lingua franca. It was the language of international correspondence. And we know that for sure because of the Tel El Amarna letters. Okay, these are letters, it's a correspondence. I'm sure you've heard of the El Amarna letters. They're actually a correspondence between the Pharaoh of Egypt and his underlings in Canaan, the people he's put in charge. And they're written in Akkadian. They're not written in Egyptian. So we know that for sure. So if Moses, again, was being groomed to be a pharaoh or a diplomat or some other high office in the household of Pharaoh, I think it's reasonable to assume he probably had to learn Akkadian. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Again, it's still an argument from silence because we don't actually know what he read. That the question then becomes, okay, if he could read it, what is he reading? There's no evidence in Egypt that you have libraries from Mesopotamia in Egypt. You have lots of correspondence. You got lots of letters and documents and land deeds. And wouldn't that have been awful, to spend your youth, deciphering economic texts, like somebody's bill to somebody for 10 sheep, treaties, I guess, would be better. You got to learn that stuff. But so we don't really know, again, what he would have been reading. On the other side, there's so much that is overtly polemic in Genesis 1-11 against Mesopotamian material that it's really next to impossible. And in fact, it would just violate what you actually see in the text to say that whoever wrote Genesis 1-11, or at least this part of Genesis 1-11, was not looking at a Mesopotamian text specifically to respond to things in that text. Because it's more than like deity names and stuff like that. It's even grammar in some places where they want the literate person to know what they are tracking on and what they're objecting to, how they are subverting the Mesopotamian material that they assume the reader knows. It gets very detailed. So there are places you just have to have that in front of you, unless I guess you memorized cuneiform or something. Again, that's possible. There were people who did that. So it's a back and forth, for me. I think the more reasonable explanation is that Genesis 1-11 or was either composed or edited during the exile with this strategy in mind. But I won't say that it's impossible that Moses, could have known that and had access to the material. We don't see a path, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one.
So Heiser gives us 3 explanations to choose from for the post-flood Nephilim. The first and second options I totally disagree with. As I mentioned before, Noah was perfect in his generations, but the scriptures also tell us that the entire earth was flooded, and it was to destroy all flesh except for Noah and his children, so option 2 also cannot be true. But his third option, that there may have been a second incursion, could still be a possibility, although it seems like more of a stretch than what Skiba said earlier. But at any rate, I would love to hear your thoughts on this matter. How do you think that these giants survived the flood? Let me know in the comments. And I pray that this video has been a blessing to you, and may God shine his face upon you and give you peace.